Good day, everyone. I'm Raphaella Elaine Miranda, and I'm currently affiliated with the De La Salle College of St. Benilde as a part-time faculty member. Today, I'll be giving an introductory lecture about feminist epistemology. My discussion will be divided into three main parts. First, as a form of introduction, I'll give a brief overview of epistemology as a branch of philosophy and what it concerns itself with. Second, I will be introducing the idea of feminist epistemology within this context. Third, and this is the meatier part of the lecture, I will be discussing feminist standpoint theory as a kind of feminist epistemology. Since this is an introduction of sorts, I felt the need to give a brief introduction of epistemology as a branch of philosophy. Similar to other disciplines, philosophy is subdivided into several branches, each of which has their own specific concern. One branch of philosophy is something that we call metaphysics, and I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the term. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that deals with first principles and abstract concepts. Some examples of these concepts are cause, substance, being, time, and space, to name just a few. Another example, and this is a branch of philosophy we're probably more familiar with. It's called ethics. And in our lecture series for you today, we also have a discussion that deals with feminist ethics, so stay tuned for that. So ethics deals with concepts of good and right. We also have, epistemology, on the other hand, deals with questions related to knowledge. Its main concern is the nature of knowledge, justification, and rationality of belief. It deals with questions such as, how do we know? Do we know anything at all? What criteria should we use to determine whether we have knowledge of anything at all? We've been asking these questions and a lot more of its variations and a lot more epistemological questions since the ancient Greek period. But all the while, we have subscribed to the assumption that knowledge is universal in a sense that it is accessible to all knowers, regardless of their particularities. It was only really in the 1970s when feminists and post-colonial thinkers challenged this assumption. And they did this by asking about the we involved in the knowing process. Feminist epistemology arose as a contestation to the assumptions that we can know through exposing the implausibility of knowledge in general, as well as the implicit assumptions in universally accepted ideas such as neutrality, objectivity, reason, and impartiality. Knowledge and the conditions by which we gain knowledge have an underlying element of politics that, prior to feminist epistemology, was left unrecognized. The project then of feminist epistemology is to expose and make sense of these political underpinnings. It's important to note, however, that when we talk about feminist epistemology, it's not a unified set of epistemological assumptions and methodological approaches. Instead, it is varied forms of critiques and frameworks that question fundamental epistemological assumptions. Specifically, it investigates the role of gender in the conception and production of knowledge, as well as our inquiry and justification. According to Lorraine Code, in her 2006 essay, Feminist Epistemology in Women's Lives, through feminist epistemology, feminists interrogate a history of exclusions and unknowings that have installed affluent, educated white men as principal dispensers of knowledge, rational judgment, and acknowledgement. One way of doing feminist epistemology is through feminist standpoint theory. When we talk about feminist standpoint theory, it simply connotes that we begin a critical inquiry about the world from the perspective of women and from women's experiences. And we use that as our point of departure. Beyond just a form of epistemology, however, as Sarah Harding would discuss, she defined feminist standpoint theory as a methodology and a philosophy of science that is framed within feminist social theory and political commitments. In that way, feminist standpoint theory is also a kind of critical theory, in a sense that it is emancipatory in nature, or its overall goal is emancipation from unjust social structures. Critical theories seek to describe social reality from the vantage point of the marginalized to help find ways to change it. Its central claim is that women and other marginalized groups have access to sites of epistemic privilege by virtue of their social location. By its central claim, we mean here, of course, feminist standpoint epistemology. These sites grant them a starting point of inquiry into power relations between their groups, the groups of the marginalized, and their oppressors, which are typically the socially dominant persons or actors. It's not a relativist epistemology and pursues objectivity through the critique and correction of dominant rationalities, because these dominant rationalities are often hegemonic and they distort reality. Additionally, feminist standpoint theory recognizes and analyzes the role that social location plays in epistemic agents in their knowledge acquisition. So when we speak of epistemic agents, we simply mean these are people with capacities to know. And when we speak of social location, it's comprised of ascribed identities. And these ascribed identities can be in the form of gender, sexuality, class or socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, or disabilities. And these come along with social roles and social relations. So all of these factors put together determine one's social location. For instance, my social location is that I am a middle-class woman of color. So these social locations not only influence epistemic practices in terms of knowledge acquisition, but also in terms of how people who belong in these situations really experience the world. Because specific situations can be a reason for oppression or a source of oppression, people who belong in certain social locations or belong within the intersections of multiple marginalized identities suffer from the dominant social structures. To give an example of this marginalization and the experiential aspect of it, what comes to mind is one of the interviews that I was able to document. So this is work in the development sector, and my primary job in documentation is to kind of write down the key points of different kinds of interviews. For this interview in particular, we talked with an organization who worked with women and disabilities. Overall, the project of the study was to understand how organizations help raise awareness on sexual and reproductive health in different communities. So the said organization began with a project on women with disabilities taking action on their sexual and reproductive health. The interviewee was one of its founders, and they shared the experience of assisting women with disabilities to courts to file cases. More than discussing or educating women about sexual and reproductive health, they also educated women about their rights and provided legal assistance, especially to women who were victims of sexual assault or sexual violence. So when they go to these courts, they shared that even if there was free legal assistance available to women who are victims of sexual violence, these accessible assistances proved very challenging for women with disabilities. They shared their experience with one of their clients who was hard of hearing. So when we talk about people who are hard of hearing, they are not necessarily deaf, but as the name very straightforwardly says, they have difficulty hearing, which means that the sounds that we normally would hear might be a notch lower in their when they hear it. Now, we can imagine that this is extremely difficult on regular days. But during the pandemic, when people wear masks and there's really no way of um, overcoming that difficulty by reading someone's lips, it's much, much more difficult for these people who are hard of hearing to make out what's being said. Despite some public offices offering assistance, when it comes to hearing disabilities, most of these services are only for deaf people. Admittedly, I was only introduced to the idea of the lack of support for people who are hard of hearing when I when I when I documented that interview. So even if there are sign language interpreters available in inclusive offices, the interviewee pointed out that people who are hard of hearing aren't really well versed in sign language. So that form of assistance does not really help them as much. They shared that what was necessary was captioning, where there are ways by which the people who are hard of hearing can visually see what is being said, and that would be through captioning. So these supposedly accessible services of free legal assistances are less accessible to people with certain disabilities because the disability proves to be a barrier to that access. In the same way that the lack of wheelchair ramps make it difficult for people in wheelchairs to enter supposedly easy to access buildings. Okay. Comparatively, then, the experience of able-bodied persons are significantly easier because they don't have to overcome that barrier. The barrier doesn't really exist for able-bodied persons in the same way that it exists for persons with disabilities. So that's an example of how women or other marginalized groups experience the world differently by virtue of their social location. So feminist standpoint theory then has three fundamental assumptions. The first of which is that knowledge is socially situated, in a sense that our access to knowledge depends on a lot of factors that our materiality is enmeshed with. Second, marginal groups are socially situated in ways that let them ask more questions compared to people who belong to non-marginalized groups. Third, inquiry about power relations must begin from the standpoint of the marginalized. Like what I mentioned earlier, it is a critical theory in a sense that it has an emancipatory project. And in order for them to actualize that emancipation, an inquiry has to begin from the standpoint of these marginalized. Feminist standpoint theory exists then in the intersections between epistemology and social political philosophy, precisely because it recognizes the situatedness of knowers and the politics of knowledge acquisition, production, and reproduction. Additionally, more than a descriptive analysis of reality, feminist standpoint theory also has what we call normative commitments. Namely, it's that socially situated knowledge is objective instead of relativist, and marginalized groups have a form of something that we call epistemic privilege, that grants them the capacity to see through hegemonic frameworks that dominant groups have normalized. Marginalized groups have the capacity to ask more questions regarding social structures because they are the ones experiencing the contradictions of these frameworks. Put simply, the marginalized are the ones who experience the impact of structures created to cater to dominant social groups. At this juncture, I think it's also important to highlight and clearly define what we mean when we talk about standpoint, because it's a term that we have repeated several times throughout the discussion. So standpoint has its roots in Marxism. And well, standpoint theory as a whole is great as a form of critical social theory is influenced by Marxism and a philosopher called Georgy Lukács. So in Marxism, a standpoint is taken to mean collective identity or consciousness. Marx, of course, in his text, used this to refer to the proletariat as a class. In feminist standpoint theory, however, a standpoint is earned through the experience of collective political struggle and emerges when the marginalized become conscious of their situation within the context of social power and oppression. They are collective in a sense that recognizing one standpoint and coming it together also involves recognizing others as occupants of similar or the same standpoints. Recall I mentioned the concept of epistemic privilege earlier in the discussion. And again, epistemic privilege means that they have access to a special kind of understanding of the world, both from the point of view of the oppressed and their oppressor. This epistemic privilege is not something that people gain by virtue of social location alone. For instance, just because a woman is a woman of color and is part of the lower middle class and is disabled does not automatically mean that she or the group of people who have similar social locations have epistemic privilege automatically. Epistemic privilege is only gained when certain persons or groups arrive at the standpoint. So that means that in order to have epistemic privilege, there has to be a necessary process of critical reflection about what's happening in society, as well as the way by which society affects persons in certain social locations. Epistemic privilege then can be understood as a product of social struggle or a product of a critical reflection about a group's situation. Now, going back to some of the basic claims of standpoint theory, recall that I mentioned earlier that it allows for us to have a more objective knowledge of the world. And to some, that may seem strange because the fact that we recognize particularities means that the particularities make it hard for us to access a universal reality because there are hindrances in the form of particularities. But in feminist standpoint epistemology, it's not necessarily the case. That's because society today is dominated by hegemonic rationalities that continuously impose frameworks of thinking and stereotypes. And these really need to be challenged. What this does is that it masks itself as objective reality and a part of the natural social order, when in fact the structures that govern the way that society works is all man-made and is made and imposed by dominant groups. For example, to illustrate, let's recall the stereotype that women should be homemakers. And I think this is a common notion of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a woman in a family. This expectation or this stereotype has led to disproportionate allocation of care work to women. What does that mean? This means that women become in charge of taking care of the house. And unless they have a sensitive partner, a lot of the time these roles really fall onto them. For instance, they're the ones who cook, who clean, who wash the dishes, but at the same time, they also have to work. They also have to take care of the kids. They also have to make sure that the studies of the children are all going well. So another harmful example of this kind of stereotype is the gendering of certain professions. And this happens when we create automatic associations of certain jobs to men and women. Engineers, for example, are depicted in textbooks given to students in the preschool level as jobs that men usually take. Teachers, on the other hand, and nurses are often depicted to be professions that females are inclined to. In our field, when you mention the word philosopher, you don't really think of women as philosophers. Probably the people who come to mind are straight white men. So these stereotypes and thinking frameworks exist because reality is twisted by male-dominated ideologies. So it's not necessarily the case that engineers are men, or that engineering is a field that is exclusively for men, or a field where men are the dominant ones. It's just that society is structured that way, when in fact women can be engineers as well, and women rightfully should if that's something that they want. So to add to this, the frameworks that I talked about, they seem very natural because these ideologies shape the understanding of the marginalized the moment we become part of society. And by that, I mean by birth. For instance, whenever people have babies, they usually have something called baby reveals. And from the color of the balloons and the paraphernalia, we can typically tell what gender the child is. Okay, as if gender is something that automatically comes with their sex. Okay, so we see this, for instance, in the colors and toys that are assigned to these babies even before they are born. Parents typically pick out pink for baby girls and blue for baby boys. These associations of objects and even colors to exclusively girls and exclusively boys become part of our day-to-day existence because it was naturalized to be that way. For instance, for many people, myself included, it was only at a latter point in my life when I started to question why pink is automatically associated with women and womanly things. So we are naturalized to think that way, to subscribe to these categories and associate them with certain genders. And growing up to these narratives, women experience the forms of oppression that come with it. So to add, the emergence of individual identity consists in really challenging these stereotypes. When women can assert power over their identities, they gain power and control over their lives. For instance, if a woman wants to be an engineer, despite social structures and her parents telling her that, no, being an engineer is something men do, that's a way of her taking control of her life if she still chooses to take an engineering program. So collectively, challenging these hegemonic ways of thinking imposed by the socially and politically dominant can really change the way that society works. For instance, if we normalized women in STEM, then it would be easier for the next generation of women to just enter STEM without people asking questions about why they want to enter a man's profession, as if engineering and STEM are men's professions. This change happens only when we look at the world from the standpoint of the oppressed and the marginalized. because they have the capacity for something that we call double vision, where they're able to understand how oppression works from both their point of view as the oppressed, as well as the point of view of the oppressors. Non-marginalized people, however, do not have access to this double vision and would not be able to have the epistemic privilege that the marginalized have because they don't have a concrete and material experience of this oppression. An example of this would be how women who tend to owe the members of their family are in positions to see how the patriarchy fails to meet these people's needs because she experiences that in her day-to-day life. Okay? But what does this mean then for the non-marginalized? This doesn't mean that they should continue their ways of being completely undisturbed. Okay? When we ask about what role they should play in these struggles, the question is simple. They should be open to listening to the plights of the marginalized. Non-marginalized people are often content with social structures because they're not the ones being oppressed by it. And thus they have the power to simply ignore these kinds of injustices. For instance, that's why even in our day-to-day conversations, men refuse or outright dismiss the idea that feminism is important. That's because they don't really experience the struggles of being women and the kinds of oppressions that we go through in our everyday lives. They can simply ignore these kinds of injustices because they don't directly affect them. But although they cannot rather have access to specific standpoints, the non-marginalized can still be part of the process by being allies and supporters of causes raised by the marginalized. An example of this could be something as simple as learning about the causes of the marginalized and what they're fighting for, and especially to give them forums and spaces to discuss their advocacies without having to dominate the room. The non-marginalized have to open their eyes and recognize that there are other ways of structuring the world, especially in such ways that does not oppress minorities. The limitation, however, is that non-marginalized persons cannot take on dominant roles in social movements because, of course, social movements are propelled and their ethos is really directed by the people who started them or the marginalized who use that movement to help forward their cause and to change social reality. For instance, straight cis men can be part of the feminist movement, but they cannot assume a dominant role in defining as well as knowing its aims because the movement seeks to challenge that dominance. Okay, so it would be ironic if the feminist movement is led by the very characters that it wants to usurp from their position of power, for lack of better term. And we're down to the last part of the discussion, and I guess this is more of a takeaway. For me, the takeaway is that recognizing our social power and determining our social location can help us recognize the roles that we can play in changing the social fabric. For me, the beauty of standpoint epistemology and feminist epistemology as a whole is that it recognizes the material conditions of women and the marginalized and uses this as a starting point to really challenge oppressive structures. In that way, it is a very hopeful and practical philosophy because it keeps the emancipatory spirit alive and it continuously believes that change can be made in this world no matter how complicated social structures are. More so, it's a kind of thinking that is really grounded in reality. And I think that having more people do this critical philosophizing would make a difference both in how we do appreciate philosophy and how we interact with the world through philosophy. And that's it for me in this brief introductory lecture. Thank you all so much for your time, and I hope you all take care.